Hello, and welcome to a game discourse concerning a game that, for the first time in a long time, has struck me as a fine example of how this medium can be elevated to the realms of artistry, I think. And despite the video game industry having been going strong for a good 30 years now, how it can still be utilised in imaginative and curious ways and throw out curveballs like Life is Strange that extend far beyond the formulaic AAA genres that get churned out on a regular basis, I think. Now, I can't speak highly enough of this game, and as it's comparatively recent compared to the games I usually discuss, I assume there's a fair amount of people that either haven't played it yet, or haven't completed it yet, or perhaps haven't even heard of it yet. And if that's the case, I want to prefix this talk by saying, if you haven't played it, I highly recommend you do, and I don't recommend anyone listen to this if they're halfway through the game or are interested in the game, because I will be providing spoilers and discussing the quite convoluted twists and turns of this game in depth, and frankly, I would hate to be responsible for, ruining this experience for anyone. So, Life is Strange is a narrative-driven title by Parisian developer Dontnod, and it was released in 2015, and it's essentially a glorified story-centric point-and-clicker, and its unique commitment to plot supersedes most common video game achievement criteria, such as leveling and point scoring, which made it quite appealing to me. But that said, it does draw some comparisons with decision tree heavy games such as the Telltale games, who are the guys that do the Walking Dead and the Game of Thrones games, and also Until Dawn. And they're similar in this sense that your answers inform the plot trajectory, and they are tallied at the end of an episode to compare your intentions and your actions against other players. But aside from this, and these kind of basic gameplay mechanics, I think that's pretty much the extent to which Life is Strange can be compared to any of its contemporaries, I think. In terms of story, the game uses a basic but somewhat unusual premise in that you take control of a college student in a contemporary setting, and you discover you have the ability to rewind time. In tandem to this, there's the rekindling of a childhood friendship between you and your best friend Chloe, and the disappearance of an elusive student known as Rachel Amber, whose absence permeates and profoundly affects most of the key events and characters you interact with. And, that's the basic premise of the story. But what I really love about this game, and what enamoured me with it, because I do find it hard to completely fall in love with a game, but the sheer level of detail and development given to the themes and characters within this story, and how these things branch out intuitively and cohesively into the gameplay mechanics, the UI design and the general aesthetics of the game, such as, the menu screens and the handwritten typography and things. This feeling of nostalgia being indicative of the protagonist Max. These things come together brilliantly and really ingrain us in the youthful psyche of the central character and story, and elevate Life is Strange from being a mere pass-the-time video game to a more cerebral and thought-inspiring and immersive experience, I think, that firmly elevates it into the realms of multimedia artwork. Now, on the note of this multimedia artwork idea, I just want to digress slightly on this point, and I've delved into art theory before in my game discourses, but I believe it's particularly relevant to Life is Strange, and helps me legitimize it as an art form, as a piece of artwork. Particularly if we consider the German art theory known as the Gesamtkunstwerk, which I think is highly applicable to this game. And the theory loosely translates from the original German to total artwork, as devised by the German composer Richard Wagner. Now, Wagner felt in his time in the 1800s that the medium of opera met this criteria of total artwork, because it cohesively brought together an array of artistic practices such as painted backdrops, story, narrative, music, acting, and costume. And all of this kind of coalesced to create a compelling and immersive story for the audience, who would be seated in a beautifully designed opera house as well. So the idea of this total artwork is to completely immerse and make the audience a participant in the art. And for my part, for a long time, I felt that certain video games, which combine the multidisciplines of audio, visuals, story, the architectural construction of the 3D space, I feel like they can be elevated to these standards of total art, particularly as the added element of the video game is the player controls and interacts within the game, through their protagonist and the avatar, which further creates this immersion into the artwork, which Richard Wagner couldn't even have conceived of in his time. So Life is Strange being a story-focused game that not only gives the player control of their avatar, Max, but permits them to make choices on her behalf that inform the narrative trajectory of the game and the outcome, is one of the definitive factors I think legitimize it as an enduring work of art rather than a mere video game. Now, before I move on to the themes, a final factor that I'd like to make about this game and what makes it stand out for me, which may come across as slightly pretentious, off the back of just talking about art theory, but firstly, the game deals with some mature and quite taboo subject matter around drugs, student-teacher relationships, sexuality, things like that, which, unlike, for example, the Grand Theft Auto games, which also cover this subject matter, I think it handles quite realistically and in quite a mature way. And I feel the handling of this subject matter separates it from many video games on the market today. Secondly, I do really enjoy that there are some informed references in this game as well, not only to popular culture, but also to high art and literary culture as well, which again separates it from basically anything else that I've played. Just on a personal note, I studied photography for a number of years and I collect cameras. So I really enjoyed the references to Diane Arbus and Louis-Jacques Daguerre and other masters of photography, which are, in this game if you go looking for them. And also, there's just little tidbits like Warren's movie references and his Schrodinger's cat philosophy t-shirt and stuff, which is really cool. And, there's mentions of, Blade Runner, Studio Ghibli, Jack Kerouac, Stephen King, J.D. Salinger. There's all these sort of like little references in there, which, I found to be quite neat. But having said that, when it got to the point that these Easter eggs were being placed on, for example, the license plates of the cars, where you have, Twin Peaks and Donnie Darko and Breaking Bad, it got to the point where it was almost kind of parodying itself and parodying these references, which, I liked it, but I felt that they were just trying to perhaps be a bit too clever with it, and you don't want to sabotage the story by slipping into parody, particularly when the story is getting, getting quite climactic and it's getting quite dark, and you're dealing with things like drugs and suicide and murdered teenagers. So I felt there was a line that Don't Nod kind of straddled there, but nonetheless I thought it was really cool. Now, as I mentioned, it's not merely these references and interactions that make this an awesome game, but also the themes, character and story, which I'm going to proceed to delve into now. And once again, this is a second and final warning to anyone that hasn't played the game, but from this point on, I am going to be providing quite heavy spoilers and discussing the narrative arcs and the themes and the story in depth. So, of all the themes in Life is Strange, the most important concept is time, which sounds blindingly obvious, but really getting down to it, it's amazing to see just how much the idea of time and the concept of time permeates every facet of this title. The time element of Life is Strange informs not only the rewind mechanic, which makes this game so innovative and interesting, but also the high school setting we find ourselves in, which is itself a transitional time in life, where young people are making the uncomfortable move from youth and adolescence into adulthood. I don't think it's an accident that Max Caulfield is in this setting and 18 years of age, which in most countries and cultures in the world is the age at which someone reaches their majority. Nor do I think it's coincidental that as each chapter of the game progresses, the story becomes increasingly dark and increasingly serious, because it is emblematic, I think, of this loss of innocence and the passage of time from, childhood innocence into adulthood. For example, at the beginning of the game, we undertake decisions that might cause our classmates to like or dislike us, or cause a pot plant to die. But later in the game, we make decisions that will literally result in the life or death of another human being. Indeed, it is this very idea of innocence that's intrinsic to youth that Mark Jefferson pursues and seeks to preserve through his photographic sessions and his obsession with youth that he describes as the aura, of youth. So yeah, all of the traumatic events that come to pass are almost, tied to his obsession with this aura and this formative period of someone's life. Many people also describe Life is Strange as a nostalgic game, which through its harmonious music, the story, and the whimsically sunlit, kind of setting, it undoubtedly is, but the term nostalgia is by definition a yearning for the past and conveys a sort of sadness which is bound to the relentless passing of time. Nostalgia also comes in the form of Max's pursuits as an artist. It's very apparent in the game that she favours analog photography over digital, and also that she uses a handwritten journal rather than an online blog, for example. And this creates an interesting juxtaposition between the digital cameras and the social media pages and the mobile phones that we see the characters using and communicating with, which is representative of the modern and the present, and Max's infatuation with mediums of the past. So there's this time dynamic of old and new that inches into the cultural and sociological elements of this game, and for example, how new technology permits things like the viral bullying and the video of Kate Marsh, which informs much of episode 1 and 2, which I'll discuss in depth later on. Finally, the whole photography aspect of this game is itself linked to the idea of time, because photography by its very nature as an artistic medium captures a single moment in time, a snapshot of reality of a given person, time or place that is then preserved and immortalized. And it is in fact, an aspect of the story that's explored later in episode 3, where Max creates an alternative timeline through returning back to a photographic moment. So these examples of time in Life is Strange show that the theme is important, but I think all of them together are eclipsed by the game mechanic and the story device of Max's ability to rewind time. Chaos theory and the butterfly effect are the prevalent applications of time that are explored in Life is Strange, and what make it both unsettlingly Twilight Zone-esque and beautifully unique, I think, in equal parts. Now, the butterfly effect is something we've seen explored in other mediums, not least the movie The Butterfly Effect, but also in the Japanese anime The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, and perhaps most comparable to Life is Strange, I think, is the 2001 movie Donnie Darko, which in itself is an impressive pseudoscientific movie that explores the idea of tangent universes, much akin to the latter episodes of Life is Strange. Indeed, as a pop culture reference, one of the license plates in the game actually spells out Donnie Darko, and as I mentioned earlier, it's a kind of self-aware nod to similar subject matter. And I think that Donnie Darko is a fine example of how the butterfly effect is used, but for my part, the player participation and the decision-making of Life is Strange make it far more engaging and a far more exciting exploration of this theme. And, the other mediums are incapable of contending with this, as, this player interaction contributes quite heavily to making this quite a thought-provoking concept, because, you will change the course of events if you make certain decisions. So, just looking briefly at the science and terminology behind Max's abilities, it's prudent to mention, I think, Edward Lorenz, and I won't delve into this too heavily, but I find it really personally interesting. Now, Edward Lorenz was a pioneering meteorologist in the 1960s, and what he started doing was exploring weather forecasts and subsequent weather patterns. And what Lorenz discovered by putting precise weather forecast data values into a computer was that the most minute subsequent fluctuations in temperature, humidity, or wind, for example, could radically alter the results and how these weather patterns would develop later on. And this discovery later crystallized into the analogy known as the butterfly effect, which, to paraphrase, is that if a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon rainforest, it will contribute to causing a tornado 6 weeks later, halfway across the world, which wouldn't otherwise have occurred if the butterfly hadn't flapped its wings. So basically, in a nutshell, the starting conditions of a given event are highly sensitive, and if one element changes or is in a certain state, it will radically alter the results later on. This is basically the entire premise of Life is Strange in terms of story and gameplay, and looking at this analogy of the butterfly effect, we come to understand why Episode 1 is called Chrysalis, because, of course, a chrysalis is the pod from which a butterfly is born, and the beginning of the game marks the discovery of Max's powers, and also the starting conditions of these tangent plot points that echo out across the rest of the game. From Max's selfie to Kate Marsh's bullying, and perhaps most importantly, I think, Nathan and Chloe in the bathroom. It's prudent to note that the course of this game offers a literal translation of the butterfly effect analogy too, because as Max discovers her powers, we see a blue butterfly in the bathroom, and she also prophesizes the tornado coming to Arcadia Bay, meaning that the entire game trajectory has literally mimicked the aforementioned cause and effect of a butterfly causing a tornado. In tandem to this, as time passes, we also have things like dying wildlife and beached whales and, a solar eclipse and stuff, which is just further really interesting evidence of Max's destructive meddling of space-time. So, I think this broad strokes look at how time is a driving idea behind this game is enough to go on for now, and it will probably crop up more later on when I discuss the characters, but now I want to look more generally at the sub-themes of culture, identity, and contemporary society, which will guide us into the breakdowns I'd like to cover shortly. Now, the cultural and societal and identity elements of Life is Strange are best looked at first by considering the setting of Arcadia Bay, I think, which in many ways is Western culture and modern culture under the microscope, I think. Firstly, looking at the etymology of the name Arcadia, which is an actual place in Greece, but is more popularly known by its utopian Greek. It's in Greek mythology, and it's this kind of utopia. And in this mythological context, Arcadia is a place that's abundant in nature, and an example of mankind living peacefully and harmoniously among animals and nature in this kind of land of plenty. Now, this is significant in two ways regarding the Arcadia Bay of Life is Strange. On the one hand, this oneness with animals and harmony seems forebodingly relevant to how the game progresses, because, of course, as it becomes increasingly dark and twisted, we see animals dying in droves, from the beached whales to the birds falling from the sky, which can be seen as a metaphor for the increasing disharmony of the game's menacing events and Max's unnatural abilities. And ultimately, the foreshadowing of Arcadia Bay's impending destruction, I think. The second significant factor is economic in the context of this game, and it hinges on how ruthless capitalism and industrialization, which is embodied by the Prescott family, is ruining the natural equilibrium between man and nature that Arcadia typically represents. We know that the Prescott family are buying up the town piece by piece, and that it's undertaking property development projects such as Pan Estates, which, as we see in protest flyers throughout the game, are being held responsible for destroying jobs, wildlife, and natural resources. The more inquisitive players who talk to the less relevant characters in this game will also know their discontent, as the fishermen, for example, around Two Whales Diner, frequently admonish the Prescotts and their destructive disregard for the symbiotic man and nature leanings of Arcadia Bay and its fishing industry. I mentioned that the setting is Western culture under the microscope, and I think the austerity of the inhabitants of this town and the fishermen, due to the immoral capitalism of the Prescotts and the starkness between the haves and the have-nots, are basically a prime example of this. We also have the connotations of the Native American heritage of Arcadia Bay, and what we know of Native American heritage is that they're known for their spiritual and societal integration with animals and nature, which complements this equilibrium and the term Arcadia, kind of symbolizes, and also accounts for the spirit and the dough that we see at intervals throughout this game as well, I think. Now, taking a step forward from the setting and into identity and culture here, within Arcadia Bay we have the contemporary high school setting of Blackwell Academy, in which numerous issues are explored that are particular to today, namely coming-of-age, identity development, friendship, cyberbullying, technology, high and low culture, and drug use. And this cluster of issues are intertwining threads of story that wrap or come wrapped within another theme, which I feel is dominant in Life is Strange, which is the philosophy of morality and ethics, which are, of course, explored uniquely through the character of Max, who I'm going to discuss in detail now. But one of the things I love about this game is that the decisions taken, whether moral or not, don't rest solely with Max, but are almost exclusively down to the player. which in many ways make this game question our own personal values, I think, whether you make decisions based on your own personal beliefs or make them based on trying to win the game, as it were. And it makes this a much more engaging exploration of this concept rather than passively observing a narrative unfold like in most video games or cinema. Now, turning to the characters and looking first at the protagonist of Max Caulfield, we see a character who has a definitive and perhaps debilitating trait of introversion. And to a large degree, this introversion is a product of insecurity and low self-esteem, and it informs the narrative and decision-making aspects of the game, as Max's story arc is concerned with coming to terms with this internalizing and how failing to speak up can have real-world consequences. Early on, we're given the option to be evasive and be passive, which is what Max will often default to when we aren't making decisions for her. But we soon realise that this can allow problems to escalate, quite far beyond our control later on. Indeed, as the plot progresses, we are able to craft a more assertive Max, particularly after the Kate Marsh incident, which see things get real, as it were, and I think this is a turning point in the game. And the game takes a step into creating real life or death consequences from our actions. Also in tandem to this, the rekindling of Max's friendship with the very forthright character of Chloe Price, who is certainly the yin to Max's yang, and an essential confidence-inspiring half of this symbiotic and mutually integral friendship, again further allows the character development to take place and Max to become more assertive in her own right. Now, like many great American literary protagonists, from J.D. Salinger's Holden to Herman Melville's Ishmael to John Updike's Rabbit, Max's social and cultural context is that of an outsider. We can see from the way characters like Victoria react to her that she is on the fringes of the popular high school demographic, and instead relates much more to the reserved achievers and the geek crowd such as Warren. Far from being a teacher's pet or a nerd, however, Max's relationship with teachers like Jefferson shows that he is often frustrated at her lack of forthrightness and her confidence in her own work. So Max is essentially placeless, straddling the realms of academic performance and the geek crowd by way of her detached and introverted nature, I think. It's prudent then that Max should be a photographer, which is a significant aspect of the game, and as someone that personally loves the medium of photography, I can relate to the relative comfort one has in being a photographer, because in many ways you are detaching yourself from your surroundings and objectifying the situation that you're in by looking at life through a lens, which in turn creates a sort of comfort and control and basically a psychological buffer between self and the real world. Digressing slightly, I think it's worth noting that Max shoots exclusively on Polaroid film, which I really like, and one of her cameras is a standard 600 camera by the looks of it, which I think I have somewhere, and the other one looks like a Spectra, which is a really cool Polaroid camera, which I don't own. But although I don't think the developers were remotely concerned about the state of the instant camera industry when they made this game, but it's worth noting that Polaroid discontinued their instant camera film back in 2008, much to my dismay, so I can only assume that Max has either stockpiled the hell out of her Polaroid film stock, or she's considerably wealthy, as a couple of spin-off companies still make Polaroid 600 film, but it's about $30 for 10 shots or something, which is obscene. Anyway, on the note of photography, it also works as a subtle plot device, I think, relating to Max's insecure disposition, not only as a buffer between herself and her surroundings, but the recurring motif of the Everyday Heroes photo competition, which Jefferson frequently urges her to partake in, but she kind of declines, and I think this represents literally her fear of putting something of herself out into the world, and this fear of being rejected. And again, I think the Everyday Heroes photo competition represents Max's internalizing and her insecurity, and this kind of transition between adolescence and adulthood again. Interestingly, one of the tangent realities in episode 5 shows her having successfully won the Everyday Heroes competition and travelled to San Francisco with Principal Wells, which, although not canonical with the final timeline of the game, successfully marks this change in her personality from the insular cocooned chrysalis to the assertive adult successfully putting something of herself into the world. This also marks the successful transition from adolescence to adulthood, I think, as this scenario sees Max wearing adult attire for the first time. She's wearing these boots and a conservative beige jacket instead of a hoodie and trainers, or sneakers, depending on where you're from. And I think, these aesthetics and her clothes, are symbolic of this transition into adulthood at the aptly named Zeitgeist Gallery. And again, relating back to the time concept, a zeitgeist is a term which defines something of the moment and a definitive moment within a given historical cultural paradigm. So I think everything here coalesces to show Max at her definitive, moment and her transition period, this completion of her transition. And, we see her become a lot more assertive and antagonistic as well, I think, like Chloe for the remainder of the game. It's also noteworthy in this sequence that Max is wearing a Dreamcatcher necklace, and this is symbolic perhaps that we are in a tangent slightly too good to be true universe, and also possibly nods towards the Native American heritage of Arcadia Bay, and also Max's potential status as an avatar of Native American spirit walking or shamanism, which is among the few theories revolving around this game and the elusive doe spirit that people perceive either to be Max's spirit animal or Rachel Amber's spirit animal. So yeah, there is this very subtle Native American vibe kind of undulating beneath the surface of this game. And I think it's only if you actually speak to an incidental character they mention the Native American heritage of Arcadia Bay. But actually, if you look at stuff like this, the Dreamcatcher and, the aspects of the spirit animals, it really is, in there and quite a permeable thing. Now, Max's personality as an outsider and, quote marks, hipster sort of person is somewhat genius in how it is ingrained into the very UI of this game. From the doodled loading screens to the menu screen styled like a teenage journal, the entire aesthetic is informed by the arts and crafts personality of Max and really contributes to the wistful nostalgia of the game. And also touches, I think, on my earlier point of how Max's values are thoroughly with the analog aesthetic over the technology-centric means of expression shown by her peers. So it conveys this whole conflict between old and new, and once again this time theme that much more. Now, also, I mentioned earlier the high art and literary references in this game, and there's a degree of self-awareness to these allusions which can be found right down to the character of Max and her name. The surname CAULFIELD more than likely references Holden Caulfield, who is the angsty adolescent protagonist of J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. The high school setting, Max's cynicism, and her distrust of authority make this seem likely, but for further evidence of this correlation, which really drove it home to me, is also a really blatant reference during episode 3, where if you look at a coat rack in the receptionist's office after breaking into the school, Max remarks, when observing a red hunting hat that's hanging there, that only a total phony would wear a hat like that. And the character of Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye always wears a red hunting hat and always refers to anyone in authority or fitting into social convention as a phony. So I just really like that little Easter egg there. Also noting of the numerous highbrow references in dialogue and observation is things like, if we explore Max's room and look at her books, we find references to famous French photographers such as Robert Doisneau and Henri Cartier-Bresson, both of whom are fantastic examples of the medium's ability to capture and immortalize a moment in time. And there are also kind of smaller instances where Max is talking into, she's having a conversation with Chloe and they start referencing Jack Kerouac, for example, who was, a proponent of the beat culture. Now, much conversation and theories around Life is Strange hinge on sexuality and or feminism. And I don't pretend to be an expert on feminism, queer theory, or any of that liberal arts education stuff, but it's prudent to note that Max is an overtly gender-neutral name, and the character hates being called by the gender-specific Maxine, indicating her rejection of traditional gender roles and stereotypes, I think. it's interesting that you get to play around with this rather loosely defined orientation of Max 2, particularly in two instances when you have the opportunity to kiss Chloe, and at the end of the game, you have the opportunity to kiss Warren. And for my part, I opted to kiss both of them just to see what happened. And for Chloe's part, she freaked out because obviously they're friends. And interestingly, after the Warren kiss, Max monologues that she's happy she got to show him how she feels, which I found strange because I always got the impression that she was bothered by Warren, very slightly, because he obviously fancies her. But, maybe she just meant that in a kind of nice friend zone sort of way. So anyway, for my part, I always felt that Max's tomboy androgynous persuasion made it much simpler for her to be written as a character, because of course Christian Devine, who was the main writer on the game, was writing from a male perspective. And it's also interesting to note that Max and Chloe, as the two fleshed out female personalities in this game, with depth and complexity and background, are both tomboyish in their demeanour, whereas conventional female characters sit comfortably within stereotypes such as Victoria, who's the classic high school bitch, and Kate Marsh, who's the timid, religious person. So they're quite two-dimensional and stereotypical in many ways. So I think Max's personality also broadened the appeal of this game to the male demographic too. If we look at Lara Croft and Tomb Raider as well, because playing as a female, I think there needed to be a degree of a grey area. She couldn't be a girly girl because they needed to broaden the demographic and the appeal of this game to a male crowd as well, who still, although it's shrinking, they still make up the majority of gamers today. But having said this, I am of course really happy that Max is a female lead and that it was Square Enix who opted to publish this game. The developers don't not have noted in interviews that various publishers expressed an interest in Life is Strange, but wanted to purchase it with the caveat that they rewrite the main lead to a male, which, in my opinion, is completely wrong for delivering this particular story, with this particular cast of characters and with this particular twist, which I'll discuss when I get to the character of Mark Jefferson. So, just to wrap up this overview of Max, I think there's some interesting concepts explored with her and the fact that we control her. Lorenz's aforementioned butterfly effect is one of Newtonian cause and effect, and the beached whales, the dying birds, and Max's nosebleeds, indicate some pretty interesting and interpretable high-concept writing, I think. But the climactic sequence of Max's story is what's known in philosophy as the trolley problem, and I think this is a great way to conclude these threads of story and her personal friendship arc with Chloe. Now, the trolley problem is one that's existed for many years and possibly centuries in philosophy, but is perhaps best known in its current form as theorised by the British philosopher Philippa Foot. And basically, the trolley problem is imagining that there's a train trolley hurtling down a track which forks towards either a group of people on one track and one person on another track, and you are in control of the track lever to divert the trolley to one or the other of these victims. Now, the thought experiment explores numerous situations, such as maybe the group of people are murderers, or maybe the single person is your child, and things like this essentially question the ethics of who you are and who you should save and why. But it's important to mention here because the premise of this thought experiment is quite literally translated to the closing scenes of Life is Strange and Max's character. So the dream sequence where, right at the end, there's the dream sequence where Max finds herself back at Blackwell Academy walking through endless corridors. And this works as both an epilogue of her story and, I think, a recap to remind the player of what's come before in previous episodes and who these various characters are. The dream tends to take a kind of negative slant, which focuses on the failures and the negative emotions that Max perceives others to have of her. And in a brief scenario, you transform into Victoria, which made me wonder if perhaps there's a lingering and mutual desire to be one or the other between these aspiring photographers. But regarding the trolley problem, what I found most interesting is the closing dreamscapes, which are essentially guilt trips, preempting, the decision to come. on the one hand, we get this beautiful montage of stills, like a diorama, when we're walking along this path, and there's moments of Max and Chloe, being together, and Chloe quotes kind of distilling the necessity of them being in this symbiotic friendship. And on the other hand, right at the end, we have the Two Whales diner, where every non-playable character in the game kind of comes together and implores Max not to kill them, which is really where the penny drops for the final decision you have to make, I think. Now, for my part, I'm going to admit that on my first playthrough I did opt to sacrifice Arcadia Bay, and I'm going to justify that now, because I think that despite Max bailing on Chloe and moving to Seattle for a number of years, I felt the trajectory of the story and Max's frequent forays into messing with time hinged entirely around her commitment to her friend. And as I mentioned, I feel that these two are yin and yang. They're symbiotic, and thus they are incapable of successfully living without the other one, by the end of this game. And it is without a doubt Max's story and Max's game, and the remaining inhabitants of Arcadia Bay are, excusing possibly Warren and Joyce, I think they have contributed comparatively little and impact Max comparatively less than Chloe. So by extension, they fall lower down on my personal priorities. And this is a mindset, actually digressing. Ayn Rand, the author, referred to this kind of selfishness, I suppose, as rational egoism. And she cited that it's completely pointless and self-harming to act against your own interests and, your own desires. So for the purposes of this game, where I'm not actually killing real people, I was quite happy to operate in emotional self-interest. Another reason I saved Chloe wasn't just because it's the dream team of Max and Chloe driving off into the sunset, or to spare Max emotional pain, but it's also my personal attachment to Chloe as a person and a character, which has developed over the course of the game, and I actually personally really liked her, and I think a world without Chloe would kind of suck. And a very final reason is that I think in destroying Arcadia Bay, I prevent the Prescotts from succeeding in their Pan Estates and any of their kind of ruthless capitalist expansion, desires. And, you could argue that the citizens of Arcadia Bay, as previously mentioned, are in a state of perpetual decline and depression because of the Prescotts. And my further rationalization was that, they're on a downward trajectory anyway, and if it's between the Prescotts and a tornado, I would choose the tornado. So yeah, although I did employ this rational egotism to my personal and Max's personal attachment to Chloe, and I did it without hesitation as well, I didn't feel completely guiltless, and upon seeing the ending, there was a sort of bittersweetness to their newly attained freedom at the expense of the inhabitants of the town. And indeed, when I replayed the last segment of Life is Strange to check out the Sacrifice Chloe ending, it did seem like the favoured ending as a natural conclusion to the game, due to its extensive and conciliatory tone, where we see everyone come together for the funeral, including Victoria and including Frank, lingering there in the background. Whereas the Chloe ending is a kind of brief and slightly guilty end when you're driving out of the wreckage of the town. Now, as we're talking about Chloe, let's move on to her, and although she's a non-player character, her significance in this game is on a par with Max, and a driving force for most of the significant decisions made, whether it's her prompting them, or whether it's done, with the intent of saving her. As such, I would like to hesitate in even calling her a secondary character or a deuteragonist, but rather I would say she's a co-lead alongside Max, informing as much plot development, narrative trajectory and decision-making as her playable counterpart. It's worth noting, actually, that I haven't played or even looked at Before the Storm, which is the prequel game, so all of my comments regarding Chloe here are concerned with Life is Strange proper, and this prequel wasn't made by Don't Nod or written by Christian Devine, so I'm mildly suspect of how it handles these characters, and I'd be interested to know if anyone recommends it or not, as I'm not sure whether the narrative and the characters are faithful to what's established in this first game, so I am interested to know that. Anyway, Life is Strange is as much Chloe's story as it is Max's story, and in many ways, where Max's character arc is one of attaining a freedom from the trappings of personal internal insecurities, Chloe's story is a pursuit of freedom from external forces that have profoundly and tragically affected her from childhood. It's clear that she feels a certain sense of betrayal regarding her father's death, Max's move to Seattle, her mother's remarriage, and most recently the disappearance of Rachel Amber. And her idea of freedom is overtly an external one too, as she wishes to physically transplant herself from Arcadia Bay to Los Angeles in the hope of, liberation from this trauma. So, although both characters are pursuing this sort of self-liberation amidst the mysterious Arcadia Bay backdrop, it's prudent to note the thematic contrast between Max and Chloe too, as their defining and fundamentally opposing personalities are what craft, I think, such a chemistry between them and propel this story into, one that is, not simply good, it's actually awesome, and it contributes greatly to the appeal of this game, I think. So, where Max is from a comfortably middle-class and caring family, as evidenced by her parents' recurring text messages, Chloe has had relatively little comfort due to her aforementioned childhood trauma, which results in her hostility and her mistrust of authority, and generally results in her short temper and antagonistic behaviour. The game shows how radically Chloe has changed, by comparison, because we have these tangent universes wherein we see Chloe as a straight-A student, despite her being quite heavily disabled. And in the event that we go back to see the day her father dies, we see in her early teenage years that she's clearly a very happy-go-lucky child, prior to the events that lead up to William's death. So, compared to the Chloe of the proper timeline, we see someone who has adopted all the traits of rebellion, from tattoos to dyed hair to a punk rock demeanour to a rejection of traditional gender roles, stereotypes and sexuality, all of which is quite purposefully fluid and ambiguous within the character of Chloe. We also know that she uses recreational drugs, and this actually works narratively as well because it ties her in closer to secondary characters such as Frank and Nathan, and actually results in her being in that bathroom at the beginning of the game, which prompts the entire series of events and the butterfly effect to take place. Now, I think it's worth noting here that Chloe does divide some fans, and I've seen some people expressing a degree of contempt for her, actually, as much as praise. She's clearly very self-indulgent at times and selfish at times. Periodically, she scorns Max and reverts to complaining about her messed up childhood to justify her actions. And this me attitude and inability to listen to reason is clearly a result of her inability to process the loss that she suffered. I think it's important to consider it as a product of Chloe's grief rather than, a character flaw. Now, despite the contrasting traits of Chloe and Max, these two operate in a very intrinsic, symbiotic way. It's a classic odd couple dynamic we see in great comedies and dramas, not least Sherlock Holmes and Watson, who these two seem to haphazardly emulate at times. And they are exemplary of a pair who contrast in fundamental ways, while at the same time complementing and completing the personality of the other. Max and Chloe's rekindled friendship is the single defining relationship over the course of the game, I think, and as time goes on, we witness Max managing to measure Chloe's inflammatory reactions to things, and equally Chloe's forthrightness emboldens Max to become a more confrontational and confident person in her own right. That said, Chloe is extremely volatile and gung-ho, and I think she needs Max more than the other way round when it comes right down to it. Her reaction to Max's powers is instantly one of self-gratification and self-interest, citing that they can take over the world and hunt down Rachel, completely oblivious and without wider consideration to things like the rewind ability clearly causing Max nosebleeds. Chloe's character also has a very interesting relationship with guns. There's a narrative device known as Chekhov's gun, which, to paraphrase Chekhov, is something like, if a gun appears on stage in Act 1, then it must be used in Act 2, so as not to lead on the audience. And I think this is intrinsic to Chloe's appearances throughout Life is Strange, because almost always we have Chloe being the target or the handler of a gun from the outset of the game. And I had a real concern about her ability to stay alive and survive this game, as, you know, there's always a gun present around Chloe, and it's almost a perpetual foreshadowing to the concluding moments of the game's story and the decision you have to make there. You know, combined with moments such as Chloe almost dying when she gets stuck in the train tracks and then having the option to kind of euthanize her when she's paralyzed, Chloe seems to be a character that's perpetually tied to death, and arguably we could say her consistent misfortune is the universe trying to correct itself after Max messes with time, which I think actually is the premise of those Final Destination films, but I've never actually seen one. But yeah, anyway. It's also been speculated elsewhere that the 3 bullets on Chloe's necklace indicate the 3 instances where she can get shot in the game. The first being by Nathan, the second being by herself when you're in the junkyard, and finally by Jefferson. And I think this is an interesting indicator to her fated relationship with firearms, and just quite a cool theory in general. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I opted to save Chloe without hesitation due to the intrinsic coexistence I perceive between her and Max. The trolley problem is a great and somewhat harrowing conclusion for this game, and for Chloe. Her ending is either very traumatic, you know, as an end to her life, or a bittersweet liberation from her devastated hometown. So Chloe is an inescapably tragic figure, which I think is evidenced in everything from her volatile personality to the details of her home, which I'm going to digress very slightly into now. If we look at the graffiti in Chloe's bedroom, we see a lot of anger, but we also see lots of details regarding how the past informs her present, and how she's somewhat stagnated by being incapable of letting go of it. There's some old measurements on the wall which mark her height at different ages as she's growing up, which she's kind of scribbled over with profanity, but it's prudent to note that she didn't actually get rid of this remnant of her past or her father altogether. And also, more obviously, we have the exterior of the Price household, which in the linear timeline remains only partially painted blue, but in the alternative timeline where William lives, we see the painting of the house has been completed, indicating that, you know, he fulfilled his task. But more importantly, I think this representation of the home is symbolic of how Chloe, and to a lesser extent Joyce, you know, they've just stagnated, and time has basically stood still since William's passing, you know, despite the best intentions of David Madsen. So I'm going to wrap up on Chloe now and proceed to talk next about David Madsen, who I think warrants some precedence in relation to Chloe, and also as one of the more obvious red herrings in this game, I think. Relatively early on, in fact pretty much immediately upon meeting him, Madsen displays a covetous, antagonistic and mean-spirited personality, which, as his penchant for harassment and photographing students unravels, it kind of posits him rather too obviously, I think, as an antagonist. Which is to say, Max and Chloe suspect him from an early stage, which indicated to me that it's 100% not going to be him that's guilty. And from the outset, this guy is a bit of a, you know, he's a bit of a dick, but I don't think Madsen's capable of anything overtly evil. And indeed, you know, quite to the contrary, as the subtle threads of Madsen's past come to the fore, and, you know, we kind of engage him in conversation, we discover his history as a soldier. And, you know, through his commands to Chloe, for example, I think he accidentally calls her trooper or soldier sometimes. And there's a book in his garage titled Coming Back Home, a veteran's guide. So although he's quite hostile, we start unpicking why that is, and eventually we actually see Madsen as quite a sympathetic character who's relatively placeless in the world, and he relied upon the structure and the ordered lifestyle of the military to give him this raison d'etre. And, you know, perhaps he's even suffering from some mild PTSD symptoms too, which accounts for his mannerisms in the game. You know, he clearly has this paranoia and this constant monitoring of students, which I think is perhaps due to his war experiences and this need to be in control, rather than anything kind of perverted or perverse in his personality. So for my part, I always sort of suspected that Madsen would turn out to be a good guy, and although I didn't realise it would be quite to the heroic extent it ends up being, and the moment he overpowers Jefferson is almost a liberation and a success story for him, because he remarks that he was never particularly good as a soldier, And through no fault of his own, he's not particularly good as a father figure to Chloe. And, even at the end of the game, during the showdown with Jefferson in the darkroom, he consistently gets outdone without considerable assistance from Max. And, this is a fight against an art teacher. But, the fact he does eventually overpower Jefferson is a sort of salvation that someone like David Madsen desperately wants, and I think deserves too. For him, it's an encounter that shows he's finally made a positive difference to the world, albeit in a very small and microcosmic way in the grand scheme of things. And just to note, because I do think he's quite a sympathetic character, the final decision-making you can make with Madsen is that you can conceal or you can admit to him that Jefferson's murdered Chloe. And because of this salvation I perceive this moment to have for Madsen, I opted to conceal. I basically opted to lie to him and say that Chloe, you're going to find Chloe and not that she's dead, because I think the moment can quickly turn into one of failure and loss of hope for this guy. He's in a fragile way, and I felt that nothing was to be gained from telling the truth in this circumstance. And I think the fact he does, this crime of passion in murdering Jefferson as well, if you do tell him, I think that's something that Madsen would live to regret. If you did indeed let that happen. Now, moving from Madsen on to Kate Marsh and the wider student body of Blackwell Academy, I think Kate represents two stereotypes present in a lot of high school dramas and fiction. The first being the bullied kid, and this is always the kid that can't catch a break and is scrutinised both by adults and their young peers alike. And the second is a less frequent stereotype, and that's being, the kind of devoutly religious kid. In most teen and high school drama and, settings, we have one or the other of these tropes being explored, usually represented by a secondary character. And in Kate's instance, her religion and drunken departure from that religion in the Vortex Club fuel the subsequent bullying we see her suffer throughout the first 3 episodes of the game. Now, for my part, I think Kate's bullying is significant in 2 ways. The first being the almost current affairs nature of her bullying, which represents how new technology and mass communication permits the instant proliferation of content and thus, viral bullying, which frankly makes me glad that I left high school, a decade ago, well over a decade ago, because it seems quite demoralising to me, and I'm sure this does happen quite frequently in real life. But anyway, the second significant aspect of Kate's bullying is that although Kate is, on the whole, second fiddle to the major themes of the game, she is incredibly important as the catalyst to the consequences taking a serious turn, as I stated earlier. The first life or death scenario we encounter hinges around Kate's attempted suicide, and we start realising the incremental micro interactions that we've had with her. For example, whether we choose to answer the phone to her or whether we choose to say nice things to her, and indeed what we remember about prior conversations with her, kind of culminates in this moment of life or death. Kate is also the driving force behind Max's resolve to pursue Nathan, which in turn propels the plot further into its primary red herring and antagonist, and its eventual reveal. So, although quite passive, indeed Kate is probably the mildest, most unassuming character in the game. Her maltreatment is closely a product of the creepy goings-on in Arcadia Bay and intertwined with the primary mystery, which is the disappearance of Rachel Amber. I mean, to be honest, aside from these kind of catalysts to the plot trajectory, I don't actually have that much to say about Kate, other than she is without a doubt one of the most sympathetic characters in this game. She has, quite a sickly complexion, quite a Puritan dress code, and her religious conservatism alienates her from her peers, but she's also alienated from her ultra-conservative family, in turn making her quite a psychologically isolated and lonely person, particularly after the viral video incident. So if you manage to save Kate, however, there is some interesting second-guessing that takes place among the rest of the student body, and things do start looking up for her in the end, which is really nice, I think. And it's a neat moment of realisation, not so much for Kate, who never put her foot wrong in the first place, but actually for, the wider peer group around her, who either ignored or actively partook in her bullying of, clearly quite a sensitive person. And again, it ties back with this theme of kind of morality and ethics that I was talking about earlier, which, I really quite liked. So on that note, I want to turn now to talk about Victoria Chase, who in many ways is a binary opposition to Kate and also to Max. And, she always feels like she has something to prove and needs to partake in some peer group one-upmanship. There's a Victoria in every school and every workplace, and it's a stereotype of superficiality and arrogance, masking an insecurity that persists in, quite a popular stereotype in fiction, particularly of an adolescent persuasion. I think she's basically like Draco Malfoy, but in Life is Strange. So Victoria is actually quite interesting because she's what we might consider a grey character, or rather a character that slips into various guises depending on how the game progresses and how we choose to interact with her. Her general character is to be an antagonistic bitch, which from the outset she proves to be quite consistently. But she also slips into a more helpful pseudo-ally in places if we choose to help her, particularly, after the paint bucket situation. And we also see her as a potential victim depending on how we choose to play the game. Now, the binary opposition to Max is interesting because where Max is representative of the backwards-looking and epitomises this nostalgia and the value of the analogue, I would argue that Victoria represents the ideals of the vacuous modern and the technology of today. Fundamentally, Victoria is not a bad person, but she is representative of basically everything that's wrong with the celebrity-obsessed ideals of contemporary culture and the cult of personality that things like social media bring to bear. And it's only right at the end of the game when we actually talk to Victoria at the Vortex party that we truly realise this, and, she despairs that all she really wants is to become a famous photographer. And that's prudent because it's not a photographer in general, but a famous one. And this shows her hostility towards Max and other art students is generally fostered by a sort of jealousy and a desire for recognition by her peers and the world around, the wider world around her. Victoria is also interesting in that she's the only character throughout the game who is inherently, and as it turns out, I suppose correctly, on Nathan's side. She frequently refers to his mental problems as a catalyst to his actions, and we generally write that off as nonsense when we're kind of convinced of his guilt. But in fact, it does turn out to be the case, and I think it's probably worth moving into Nathan now, as he's one of the more remorseless and I think, despite the twist at the end, one of the hardest characters to empathise with in this game, I think. His status reminds me of Draco Malfoy or Harry Osborn or Kylo Ren, which sounds obscure from these other media, but it's kind of a consistent stereotype where we have these tragic antagonists that, due to some issues in their past, make them open to manipulation by an older force such as Voldemort or Snoke or Jefferson. These characters are pushed into crossing a clearly defined moral line that they straddled, and then because they have this vulnerability and this kind of manipulated nature, and obviously some degree of stupidity as well, they opt to irreparably transition into this evil nature. I think the characterization of Nathan as a mentally unstable person was really well done, and every time he appears on screen it's really quite unsettling for me because he's so prone to these psychotic outbursts. He's obviously mental. And the particular tipping point of this is after breaking into the school during episode 3, Chaos Theory, we find some of his notes on the principal's computer, and we see that he's been obsessively scrawling Rachel in the darkroom over and over again. So, obviously a considerably mental person. But we also note of this as well that Principal Wells is aware of Nathan's mentality, which made me I was always slightly suspicious of Principal Wells, actually, because he's clearly aware of, something's going on here. But at the same time, he's clearly, a coward or a pawn of the Prescotts because he doesn't seem very confident about investigating this much further. So through this example and other incidental things such as the psychiatrist's notes that we find and the drug prescriptions in Nathan's room, and, just fleeting comments by secondary characters, an interesting portrait of this character is built up and presented over the course of the game without directly having to interact with him. Indeed, Nathan's bedroom is probably the most telling insight to his character, which hinges both on the morbid and also the tortured aspects of his being. You know, the fact he listens to whale song contrasts strongly with how he's presented in person and conveys this unsettling volatility about him, I think. Indeed, if it wasn't for his status as a Prescott, I'm almost certain that Nathan would have been sectioned rather than allowed to attend high school, because, we can see that on the part of his family, particularly his father, he's being pushed and neglected, and his very real mental problems are being neglected to try and push him into becoming a normal person. So, on this note, I think that Nathan is the ultimate red herring in this game, and up to the end I was actually convinced that it was just a case of catching him and perhaps some of his family members as well. I felt like, maybe it would be a Prescott that we hadn't yet seen who was responsible for Rachel. Because, personally, I didn't feel that Nathan had the mental fortitude and the intelligence to act alone. But I was always uniquely convinced that it was going to be a Prescott crime. But alas, Life is Strange threw what I consider to be a very nice curveball. And later Nathan goes from being a supremely dislikable character who would, I would have no qualms about vengeance killing this guy, to someone who only in the very final stages of the game becomes, if not sympathetic, at the very least understandable. Indeed, there's a few instances, such as his confession. He calls up Max and is crying down the phone to her like, Jefferson's going to kill me. And also, if you let Warren beat him up in the dorm room, you actually see these kind of glimpses of Nathan's vulnerability and perhaps the scared inner child shine through. But even in light of this, I still don't like him at all, and I really struggled to muster much desire to save him, to be honest. Which probably says more about me than it does about him, but there we go. Just finally, actually, I just want to remark on Nathan's photography style, because it's very obvious that he tries to emulate Jefferson, but his own oeuvre, his own body of photographic work, is a very interesting memento mori subject matter that shows his fascination with death and loss, and I don't think it's a vindictive documentation either, as I'm not sure in his heart of hearts that Nathan is an advocate of violence, but it almost shows this kind of fear of death and the unknown that propels his photography forward, and it shows, again, I think, a degree of vulnerability about this character. Now, from Nathan, it's probably logical to move on to Jefferson next, but just briefly I want to discuss Frank Bowers, who, like Kate Marsh, is another player-determinate character when it comes to surviving Life is Strange, and also, like Nathan and Madsen, an early red herring, I think, that becomes a target for Max and Chloe regarding Rachel. Now, there's a lot of psychological pain apparent in this game. Joyce, Madsen, Nathan, Chloe, Principal Wells, the fisherman, many characters exhibit a sort of anger and loss and pain undulating beneath the surface that is somewhat placeless and part and parcel with the discomfort and uncanniness of Arcadia Bay. But I feel this anger is exhibited most completely in the character of Frank, because for me, Frank is an angry man, but not in the psychotic Nathan sense, but rather in a very pained and human way. And as the game progresses, we realise that this is partly because Frank is in love with Rachel, and much like Chloe, if the player puts two and two together, we can strongly assume that it's an unrequited love. And like Chloe as well, Frank's antagonism throughout the game is largely a product of loss and not knowing what happened to Rachel. Now, Frank is one of the cogs and the catalysts of the Great Jefferson Conspiracy, and being a local dealer, he's the purveyor of the barbiturates that date rape young girls in the pursuit of the antagonist's strange artistic agenda, I suppose. And if you choose the appropriate dialogue options during the tornado scene, we see Frank realise this and actually come to lament this. And it's also in this closing dialogue with Frank that we actually witness his true warmth and humanity for the first time as well. And it's facets of the game like this that make me really like Frank, because he is extremely angry at society and at, Rachel's loss. But he does have a degree of humanity, and this humanity shines through in some small ways. For example, he loves dogs, and this gives him some degree of depth. And he's also really quite lenient with Chloe and the money that she owes him. And I think it speaks volumes about whether, in his heart of hearts, he's actually capable of violence against his clients, and particularly with Chloe, who, whether he'd care to admit it or not, he actually has a lot of similarities with. Indeed, it's worth noting that Frank shows up at Chloe's funeral if you choose to sacrifice her, and in his own hermit-like fashion, he kind of keeps his distance from the quiet proceedings, and nonetheless, this kind of conveys this sort of compassion that he holds for people. I also think that it's really interesting that he refers to Rachel Amber as his lioness, and this is a term that clearly has connotations with, lions are like the king. It's the top of the food chain of the jungle, of the desert, sorry. And, I think it shows that Rachel Amber is the dominant between the two, and by extension, Frank is the passive. And digressing slightly, I think it's just another neat example of how Rachel Amber's character is established, in this game, purely by the opinions other people have of her and the way that they discuss her. Just on that note, I'm actually quite reluctant to discuss Rachel Amber in any depth because my opinions, like I said, I've only played Life is Strange proper, and my opinions on her and my theories on her may well be contradicted by the events of Before the Storm, which I haven't yet played. But suffice it to say, Rachel seems like a very complicated and seemingly unknowable character, even by those close to her, and it seems on the surface she's also clearly strung along Chloe and Frank emotionally, and I suppose it will take the events of Before the Storm to ascertain precisely why that might be. But anyway, back to Frank. So Frank is antagonistic, foremost because of Rachel's disappearance, as I've just mentioned, but he's also clearly a man who has fallen by the wayside and through the cracks in society, and I think he's a direct contrast, in fact a polar opposite, to the privilege exhibited by the Prescotts. We know that Frank is a drug dealer and a former delinquent from a very religious family, but it's clear that his decision to live in an RV and as an outcast from society is a very conscious decision rather than by necessity. And despite people referring to him as a loser and homeless and dangerous, I think that Frank is simply a man who has chosen freedom rather than living by convention, and again, he's this opposite to the ideals and values of the omnipresent Prescotts, and his reluctance to live on their turf, as it were. Indeed, I think the fact that Frank lives in a vehicle is very symbolic of his freedom compared to the other residents of Arcadia Bay, and I think it's another parallel, actually, that I draw between him and Chloe, as her desires are in very many ways embodied by Frank, albeit not in the same drug dealery way. So Frank and Chloe are people that can't be owned by society or authority, and I think it's one of the significant kind of allures of both of their characters. So anyway, that's about all I have to say about Frank. There are other characters in Life is Strange, of course. We have Daniel, we have Brooke, we have Samuel, we have Warren. But personally, despite their determinate behaviours, I don't see too much overall contribution to the main story that deems them necessary to discuss, and I'm very conscious that I've been talking for a long time already. I will note, though, that I personally really like Samuel. I found him quite interesting, and he seems to have some very weird precognition or something, the way he talks about things. He's very abstract. But aside from that, and we have stereotype scenarios such as Warren being stuck in the friend zone, which really reminded me of Joseph Gordon-Levitt in 10 Things I Hate About You. And, we have these secondary and tertiary story arcs. I don't feel they warrant as much attention, so I'm going to kind of skirt over those and discuss the primary antagonist of Life is Strange. Now, Life is Strange reaches a beautiful crescendo, and at the apex of Max's character development and her transition into adulthood and autonomy, we have the character of Mark Jefferson. And the big twist is the personal betrayal he embodies as Max's idol. The build-up to the Jefferson reveal is reminiscent, I think, of many other thriller films, and, being convinced of Nathan's guilt, we head to the aptly named end-of-the-world party. And this party scenario, in which the joy and the celebration of the attendees is subverted by the protagonist's strife, is very similar, I think, to, for example, the house party in Donnie Darko just prior to Gretchen's death, and also the high school prom setting in Stephen King's Carrie, for example. And shortly after attending, the Vortex party, Jefferson emerges as the antagonist. He turns up at Rachel's burial site, and in a brutal fashion he immediately murders a surprised Chloe and kidnaps Max to become the next subject of his very strange photographic work. And personally, I was really surprised by this reveal, and I thought it was really good. But my girlfriend, who was actually really keen on watching me play this game because she really liked the story, she'd been consistently telling me throughout the game that Jefferson is involved somehow. She kept saying that guy's involved. And I'm interested to know if anyone else suspected him, because I really didn't see it coming. I mean, maybe I'm just dumb, but there we go. Early on, I will admit, actually, I did think Samuel was a bit dodgy, and I thought perhaps Principal Wells knew more than he should. But other than that, I didn't suspect any of the teachers or the faculty in this game at all. Turning to the characteristics of Jefferson, this seemingly charming mentor and teacher has very strong similarities to the guy from Hard Candy, which is a movie that came out quite a few years ago now. But he seems like someone you can trust and defend throughout the game because he's so personable and so charismatic, but he actually turns out to have a real dark side. The bad guy in Hard Candy, Jeff, turns out to be a paedophile, but that kind of gets turned on its head, and unlike that kind of twist in Hard Candy, Jefferson prevails as the antagonist, and while not overtly or intentionally a killer, Jefferson has all the hallmark traits of a serial killer in the way he goes about his photographic endeavours, both through his unassuming personality and his chosen victims. Indeed, if we look at two famously convicted serial killers, Ted Bundy and Charles Manson, they are both very renowned for their charismatic demeanour towards their victims and in the courtroom. Although I think I'm right in saying Manson didn't actually kill anyone, but rather he was so charismatic that he managed to convince his cult following to go and commit murders on his behalf. Such was his gravitas in the nomadic kind of beat culture of 60s America. So if we look at how Jefferson conducts his lectures and how students, including Max, talk about him, we can see that he has a very similar pull about him that draws his intended subjects in towards him. And of course we have Nathan, who he manipulates into a faux father-son relationship for, to utilise his wealth and resources and access Frank's drug supply. Secondly, not all serial killers, but a vast majority, tend to target young women, which is self-explanatory as Jefferson seeks out what he refers to as the aura of youth, and tends to work exclusively with female subjects. And finally, this comparison with serial killers, they tend to act with a degree of hedonism, either for lust or power or this feeling of dominance. And I think this is really quite well exhibited by Jefferson as well when we look at the subject matter of his photographs. And it's Jefferson's photographs actually that I want to talk about briefly now, and how they contrast to Max and her reasons for photographing. Now, I think Jefferson reveals a very interesting psychological idea about what it is to photograph, and where Max uses photography to detach and observe the world from the safety of the lens, Jefferson uses photography to own and to dominate. The late academic Susan Sontag covered this idea in her fantastic book on photography, which I'd recommend to anyone interested in the subject. And she drew comparisons between the act of photography and the act of firing a gun, noting that even the terminology of photography, which is to load film, to aim, and to shoot, is very similar to that of a gun. And here I quote Sontag: "There is something predatory in the act of taking a picture. To photograph people is to violate them, by seeing them as they never see themselves, by having knowledge of them that they can never have. It turns people into objects that can be symbolically possessed. Just as a camera is the sublimination of a gun, to photograph someone is a subliminal murder, a soft murder, appropriate to a sad, frightened time." I think Sontag's viewpoint is very much how we could consider Jefferson, and it's worth noting that in terms of his actual artistic output and his very perverted aesthetic, Jefferson does draw, surprisingly, real-world parallels with an actual high-art photographer. Now, the photographer, there's a Japanese photographer called Nobuyushi Araki, which is Araki, and this guy became famous as a photographer with a beautiful photographic diary titled Sentimental Journey about his wife. But his wife later died, and since that time his work has become very dark and almost exclusively features young Japanese girls in bondage and in extreme bondage scenarios. And he's really quite an acclaimed artist, but there are some real visible comparisons to make between the Jefferson's work that we see in the game and Araki's work. But if you plan on looking him up, I wouldn't advise doing it on a work computer, put it that way. So Jefferson is a very interesting characterization of not only a duplicitous, almost Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde antagonist, but also the very different applications of the camera to the world. His desire to dominate and preserve this aura of youth in a moment of helplessness really makes me interested in Jefferson's backstory. And I'm not sure if he's due to feature in Before the Storm, or whether his development in the prequel would be any good if so. But he's certainly an anomaly and an enigma, and he really maintains the player's engagement and propels the story in the closing aspect of the game. And, it seems to me that Jefferson, perhaps he has a fear of growing old, or perhaps he wants to salvage this amorous youth that he mentions of being promiscuous in Seattle. But, regardless, his photographic work does seem to have quite an erotic edge, but at the same time, he doesn't appear to commit any physical or sexual, acts on his victims. Much like the late Andy Warhol, he chooses to kind of just observe and, note this fragility and this erotica from a safe distance. So I can't really work out Jefferson. I just think he's like a really, really interesting character, and one of the best plot twists I've seen in a video game to date, I think. So with the characters considered, I think I'm just going to wrap up on Life is Strange now. I mentioned there's a prequel, which I'm yet to play, and also there's a sequel announced, which I believe is divorced from the events of Arcadia Bay. But just to conclude, this title, and as a standalone game and experience, is one of the finest video games I've played for the PlayStation 4 generation of console. The calibre of story, the pace, and the characters make it a really compelling example for how the medium can be propelled onward and upward into new realms of engagement. And I think there's a significant number of gamers that aren't looking for genre in their video games, but something just a little more compelling and a little more artistic that straddles these realms of, pseudoscience and just compelling story. And yeah, I think Life is Strange handles this brilliantly.